Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be part of this conference on Tantric Shaivism, and I'm honored to be among the people invited to speak. So, I'll be talking a little bit about the Pratyabhijna or recognition school of Tantric Shaivism and its context. First, just a little bit about my background. I had been exposed to the teachings of what's called Kashmir Shaivism, which means the writings of the Tantric Shaiva masters who lived in Kashmir about 1,000 years ago. I was exposed to those teachings through my first guru uh, when I was around 20 or so, and they had an impact. I felt something really special there, but barely scratched the surface with them. And then when I went to university to study religion and philosophy and classics, and I took a course, this was in the year 2000, from Paul Muller Ortega called Hindu Tantric Yoga. And in that course, that's where I was like, okay, I've found my vocation. I've found my field of study, which at the time, I could have been forgiven for thinking that this was, dooming me to a life of poverty as an obscure academic, because how many people are interested in the teachings of, Tantric Shaivism, that a tradition that once flourished all over Asia, but that was many centuries ago and now is barely known, barely even heard about, even in India itself. So, nonetheless, I was definitely wanting to follow Joseph Campbell's injunction to follow your bliss, and these teachings just absolutely lit me up. And at the University of Rochester, they didn't have a graduate program there. So, in this Hindu Tantric Yoga class that my esteemed senior colleague Paul Muller taught, we were assigned to read the work of Alexis Sanderson, professor of Eastern Religions and Ethics at Oxford University. And I quickly realized that he was the world's foremost expert in the field who taught in a postgraduate context. So I got myself to Oxford as soon as I could and spent 2 years reading with Sanderson. The wonderful thing about the Oxford system is that you do one-on-one tutorials. You get to work with a master scholar one-on-one quite a bit. So that was like an incredibly powerful learning experience and a bit of a trial by fire. Anyway, so I went on to get my PhD in Sanskrit and Indian studies at Berkeley, which I completed a few years ago. And my dissertation was again in this same area of Tantric Shaivism, specifically on the role of spiritual experience in Tantric Shaivism. So I'm sure you're already familiar with these terms, but just to be clear quickly, Shaivism refers to the religion of Shiva or Shiva Shakti that flourished in India from around the time of Christ to up through about 1400. That was the period of its really strong influence. And Shaivism is one of the religions that combined to form Hinduism after the Muslim conquest. The various distinct religions of India, like Shaivism and Vaishnavism, sort of came together to form Hinduism, which itself is a whole nother topic. So Tantra was a spiritual movement that flourished in India especially from about 600 to 1200, those 6 centuries, and continued to be influential after that, of course, but that was when it was very, very strong. And as a spiritual movement, here I'm making a distinction between religions like Shaivism and Vaishnavism and a spiritual movement like Tantra or yoga. And Tantra, as a spiritual movement, influenced all the different religions that were extant in India at the time. Not only India, but the wider Asian cultural sphere, in fact. So what developed were non-tantric and tantric forms of Shaivism, non-tantric and tantric forms of Vaishnavism, non-tantric and tantric forms of Buddhism. So tantric Buddhism and Shaivism and Vaishnavism are much more similar to each other than the non-tantric forms of those same religions, because, at least in the sphere of practice, the spiritual movement called Tantra was so influential that it tended to sort of take over whatever religion it was introduced into, and perhaps not change the fundamental philosophical tenets of that religion, but radically change the approach to spiritual practice within that religion. So the actual practices of Tantric Shaivism and Tantric Buddhism look very, very similar and are very, very similar, even if the names are changed, as it were. The deities have different faces, but often only slightly different. Okay, so that's just my brief introduction, which is unnecessary for a lot of you, I'm sure, but it's good to be oriented. Now, in Shaivism, with some exceptions, the most accomplished authors of the literature lived in Kashmir. Now, why should that be the case? Well, I think one main reason is that in the kind of heartland of India, the main religion that flourished was Brahmanism, the religion of the Brahmin priests, also known as Vedism, Vaidika Dharma. And again, originally this was a distinct tradition that became the backbone of Hinduism when Hinduism formed. So since Brahmanism was dominant in the heartland, Tantra flourished more effectively in the more marginal regions, further out from the center of India. And the reason for that is that Tantra in many ways challenged the predominant Brahminical paradigm. It challenged the significance and reality of caste stratification and hierarchy. It challenged the patriarchal system that was dominant. It challenged it was a transgressive movement in certain ways. It undermined and deconstructed people's culturally conditioned assumptions about the nature of reality. And in that sense, Tantra was quite radical. So no surprise that it flourished in every direction out from the Brahminical heartland of India. So it flourished in Kashmir and points further north as well. It flourished in Tibet, in Nepal. It flourished in Bhutan, as it still does to this day, and in Bangladesh, what is now Bangladesh. It flourished in the deep south, Tamil Nadu and Kerala and parts of Karnataka, and as well as in the west in Rajasthan, right? And in other areas too, Orissa, for sure, parts of Maharashtra. And so basically the geographical thing I'm describing here is just all the regions further out from the Brahminical heartland, the center of India. So Kashmir was sort of preeminent among these places, even though, it was culturally looked down upon for a while for being a little bit more sort of barbaric or whatever. But Kashmir did develop culturally at quite a rapid rate. And always in Indian spirituality, there's always this notion, this kind of mystical idea of Shangri-La, the idea that to far, far to the north in the Himalaya mountains, that is, Shiva's paradise, or that is the Holy Land, And as the cultural region grew, the Holy Land sort of got pushed further north to, what is now the Swat Valley, and in Pakistan, and that was like the fabled sacred place. And indeed, that's the place that Padmasambhava is supposed to have come from, a great master of Tantric Buddhism. Anyway, too much historical detail, perhaps, but there's a kind of romance, if you will, around the Kashmir Valley and points further to the north in the South Asian cultural imagination. Now, it so happened that Kashmir became an extremely rich cultural center precisely because it was a crossroads and a melting pot. So in Kashmir, people from Kashmir itself, from India, from Persia, from Mongolia, from China, and from Tibet all mingled together. And it was more or less on or near to the Silk Road. So no surprise then that this became a really rich cultural region and wonderfully diverse, and that there's a strong influence from shamanic traditions. And we know that the kind of real heartland of shamanism for the Asian cultural region is, of course, Mongolia. And then we get, the influence of the literary sophistication of China, and shamanic influences also from Tibet, the heavy Sanskrit influence or Sanskritic cultural influence from India, and perhaps even a dose of Sufi aesthetics from Persia, which was not far to the west. So this is just all to explain why. Why is it the case that almost all of the greatest authors and philosophers of Tantric Shaivism came from Kashmir? And they came from Kashmir in a specific period as well, of a couple of centuries where the kingdom really flourished and peace and prosperity reigned, and before the beginning of the Muslim conquest, and transgressive spirituality that challenged the status quo was highly tolerated. In fact, only one tantric sect in this period came under persecution from the king, from the royal court, and that was a group that was just too transgressive to be tolerated. Right? These are the so-called Nilambara sect, or the Black Blankets, and this was, I'm sure you'll be entertained by this. This was a group that advocated that in which the initiates were initiated as couples, and what they advocated was making love anytime, anywhere you feel so moved. So the members of the sect would take a black or dark blue blanket and cut 2 holes in it for their heads. And under the blanket, they would be naked, and the couples would go around just in everyday life, in society, in this black blanket with nothing on underneath, and having sex wherever they felt like it, in public, concealed, only by this blanket, but pretty obvious what they were doing, right? So, this was deemed to be just a little bit too far, a little bit beyond the pale. And indeed, the king put a stop to this sect. And this happened in Kashmir and in Rajasthan as well, actually. And there's even a play written around that time about anxiety among other Tantric Shaivas that they might come under persecution too. But that didn't happen, at least not in that era. So I just tell this story to give a sense of how actually open and permissive the society was. That only this sect was the one that was too extreme. So there's lots of colorful stories from that time. Srinagar is the capital of Kashmir then and now, and it means the city of Shri, the city of the auspicious goddess. And Abhinavagupta, writing 1,000 years ago, just praises it, talks about how this is one of the most incredible cities in the world, and how many people like have are awakened beings, and how, praising the women of the city, most of whose Kundalini Shakti is awake, as maybe he's exaggerating, but anyway, it definitely sounds like a very, very incredible time in the history of human spirituality. Okay, so I haven't even gotten to the the philosophy yet, but hopefully some of this rambling on is interesting. So let's indeed come to the philosophy. Well, there were a number of schools that flourished in Tantric Shaivism and that became, studied, became popular around the whole subcontinent. So even though some of these schools began in Kashmir, such as the Recognition School and the Spanda School, they began in Kashmir Valley and they spread from there. And indeed, we have manuscripts of Recognition School texts that have been discovered in Kerala, several thousand miles to the south. So certainly this was not just a regional phenomenon. So the Pratyabhijna, or Recognition School, that's what I'm going to talk about now. And it was begun by a fellow called Somananda, circa 900 or something. And his disciple was Utpaladeva, one of the most brilliant intellects and one of the most passionate devotionalists of Indian history, really, almost unique in Indian history in being a completely accomplished and acknowledged jnana yogi, right, master of wisdom and knowledge and insight, but also a bhakti yogi, passionate, loving devotionalist who wrote incredible and emotional poetry. So in him, there's this perfect marriage of intellect and emotion.